the BBC on the ropes and facing $1 billion headache. Once the gold standard of journalism, Britain's state broadcaster is now being crushed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. Its top brass have quit after being caught red-handed faking Donald Trump's words on a January 6th documentary. That's right, the BBC's flagship show Panorama completely manipulated the US president's words. Play the tape.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
Cutting out the bit where he said they were going to protest peacefully and 54 minutes apart, splicing together one sentence. Not quite how it's done. Donald Trump's hit back, telling the BBC, apologise by Friday or pay me $1 billion. So what really happened inside the BBC that day? And how did the story break? My guests are laughing at my Dr. Evil impression there, but I suspect at me rather than with me. Connor Stringer, Deputy US Editor of the Telegraph, making his Harry Cole Saves the West debut. And Sarah Selip, Republican strategist. Welcome back. Connor, you're part of this, your paper broke this story. In their wildest dreams, could you imagine a week after it's happening, the BBC facing $1 billion lawsuit from the President of the United States and his reputation in tatters?
Well, I don't think even Tim Davie expected that, hence why it's had to go so soon after we published this. Absolutely not. I think at the start there was a bit of degree as to how hard this is cut through and to how much this series of revelations were going to really impact the BBC. They have a bit of a habit of not reacting, failing to jump onto these kind of stories and to see how they kind of land in the general public. But as soon as Caroline Levitt weighed in on the Friday and we saw her accuse the BBC of being, succumbed to the woke left, and the president soon after that was followed suit. And as soon as you have Donald Trump on board, then the story explodes nationwide.
So Donald Trump likes to throw his legal threats around. $1 billion seems a little bit much. Is he being serious, or is he just, putting the thumb screws on?
I think it's a little bit of the thumb screws, but you have to assume after the past 5 years, he's had so many legal threats, so much money thrown against him from the Democrats. Fake news media plus money once again, but this is bringing it back to January 6th. I had the unfortunate pleasure of being on the Hill for January 6th, working for a congressman at the time. And, just to hear it again and again and again. But I have watched that tape so many times that the second you watch it, even just a little clip, you're like, this is wrong. This is fake news yet again. It's not even just an edit, it's fabrication.
Indeed. Let's talk to the man that broke the story. Gordon Rayner, Associate Editor of The Telegraph, is live in LA tonight. And from London, Jennie Bond, former BBC Royal Correspondent Extraordinaire. Jennie, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but first, it's Gordon. Are you part of a right-wing sinister conspiracy that is out to get the BBC as a political vendetta, as top brass have suggested today?
No, of course not, Harry.
That's all we need from you, Gordon. Thank you very much. No, seriously, though. I mean, there's been some pretty outlandish claims floating around, right?
Yeah, look, I love the BBC. I grew up with the BBC. I think people in Britain love the BBC. It's one of our cultural gems. But it's not what it used to be, and it's not what it should be anymore. And I find that rather sad. It's always been a place where you could go for impartial news and for good drama. And over the past few years, it's increasingly become sort of captured by this culture within the organisation of sort of wokery and this sort of left-wing bent. And the BBC is destroying itself. It's not being destroyed by some sort of right-wing conspiracy.
Talk us through your week. It's been quite a lively one. This memo has been circulating at the upper echelons of the BBC and been forwarded on to, I believe, government ministers who sort of have a degree of oversight over the corporation. That memo landed in your lap. Talk us through the initial reaction from the BBC and how we got to the fact that Sunday night two of its most senior executives were out on their ear.
Well, I received a copy of that document, as you say. I read through it. I have to admit, when I read the Panorama section, I couldn't quite believe it was going to be as bad as it was, as it seemed written down. And then, of course, I watched the Panorama, and then I watched the original Trump clips, and I was pretty aghast. Not much surprises me anymore. That really did surprise me. I went to the BBC on Monday. And I very much expected that they were going to, give some sort of slightly mealy-mouthed apology, say they got it wrong, say they were taking steps to rectify it, and there was nothing like that. It was a rather arrogant response. They said we don't comment on leaks, and that the person who wrote this memo, Michael Prescott, the former standards advisor, had been on a committee where people put forward differing opinions, and that was it. That was their response. So I think the reason that Tim Davie had to go in the end was, down to a lot of things, but partly down to the fact that, they just don't seem to be able to grasp just how serious problems are when they come up.
Nick Robinson, flagship presenter of the Today programme, went on a long diatribe, I suppose we could call it, this morning about these sinister forces of conservatism working against the BBC internally. What do you say to those, in all seriousness, what do you say to those allegations that actually there is a sort of an attempt by some people within the BBC to try and drag it away from what you describe as a sort of insidious wokeness?
Well, look, if there's an attempt by people in the BBC to drag it back to what it should be, which is an impartial, trustworthy broadcaster, then surely that's a good thing. And it worries me slightly that people like Nick Robinson think that there's something wrong with people trying to get the BBC back to its original founding principles. The only way of saving the BBC in the long term is for it to get back to doing that. If it continues down the path it's on, it is going to destroy itself.
Jennie Bond, veteran BBC broadcaster, former royal editor, a woman I grew up watching standing outside Buckingham Palace with an umbrella across some pretty major stories. You wouldn't have put up with this in your day of BBC News, would you?
Well, I have to say I haven't been employed by the BBC for many, many years, but when I was there for 26 years in the newsroom, I found us to be rigorously impartial. I've been listening to so much debate today, members of the public saying, oh, it must be awful to work for the BBC, and having people tell you what you must say, and leaning on you, or this side or that side of the political arena, and none of that was, and I don't believe it is now, ever true. I was never leaned on by anyone, sometimes by the palace, but by no one editorially. I was fully supported and utterly impartial, and I honestly believe that 99.9%, more than that, of the highly trained and dedicated journalists at the BBC today in the newsroom are totally impartial. That's what we do.
Something's gone wrong, though, hasn't it, in the fact that this Prescott report, it didn't just talk about the Donald Trump edit. It talked about coverage of the Middle East. It talked about coverage of trans issues and women's rights issues that have been swept up in a sort of progressive groupthink within the organisation. Do you recognise the sort of BBC today compared to your day? Because it does seem that even the guy the BBC paid to bring in, found some serious flaws.
Yeah, well, I'm absolutely not going to defend Panorama in this instance. I mean, it's an unforgivable edit, should never have happened. But I think that old mantra, if you're being shot at by both sides, then you must be getting something right. It's easy to say that, but that all through my journalistic career, much of it at the BBC, has been true. And today, listening to the broad public talking on the BBC, allowed to give both sides, they could say whatever they want on the BBC today on phonies like Nikki Campbell. Once again, there were claims that it is anti-Israel, that it is pro-Israel, that it's anti-trans and pro-trans, equal on both sides. So I think the BBC does get it broadly right, and I think we should be very careful what we wish for. I mean, if Trump went through with this would be the end of the BBC, £1 billion lawsuit, and I think a life without the BBC we would soon recognise would be very, very much poorer.
I don't think, £1 billion lawsuit is threatened, but I think he's threatened those before and settled on something closer to 16 million rather than that. Jennie, just looking a bit broader at the organisation, look, we kind of expect it from the drama department, where there's a sort of lefty tilt to the sort of dramas that are commissioned. We, don't get me started on BBC comedy, because I'll just rant for the next hour about that. We saw the sort of 550 journalists sent to Glastonbury to sort of dance in a field. It was always struck me that BBC News itself was always a little bit more careful. Do you think it's fair to say that standards have slightly dropped, though, from in the BBC News department? And it does seem to me that bosses don't seem to be quick enough to get a grip on it.
I don't know if that's true. I don't think the bosses at the BBC have got a grip on the reaction to what's happened. I mean, quite clearly, they should have reacted more quickly. They've known about this allegedly since May. An apology should have been forthcoming. So they've handled it really, really badly. But no, I do think the standards in the BBC newsroom are just as rigorous. And I do think in this age of social media, what I read on every news story is so tilted and an echo chamber. We are trained journalists, as Gordon well knows, highly trained journalists, taught to source our material, to check our material, to get the facts the best we can, as fast as we can, as accurately as we can, and then broadcast them. And honestly, that is what the newsroom does.
But I mean, does it though? Because BBC Arabic,
Yes, it does.
the BBC Arabic network have been found to be regurgitating without checking Hamas propaganda, essentially. If you compare and contrast the coverage from the BBC Arab network compared to the wider BBC, within the BBC News family, there are clearly people that don't have those same rigorous checks and balances that you would have done.
I don't know about the Arabic service. I've heard the allegations, and clearly they should be looked into. Yes, I thoroughly agree on that. But broadly, within the newsroom that I know, I think standards are just as high as they were.
Gordon, what happens next? It does seem to me that the BBC can be its own worst enemy. I think this all could have been sorted out last week, as you say, with an apology. Now that the organisation is rudderless and leaderless and frankly looks like it's flapping, how do you see the next few days and weeks playing out? And who's in charge? Who's running the show right now?
Yeah, well, Tim Davie is staying on until his successor is appointed. I think that the BBC now needs to find someone to lead the organisation who has got the backbone to do the things that Tim Davie said he would do when he got the job 5 years ago. He said all the right things. He said he was going to put impartiality first. He said he was going to crack down on people using social media, for example, to express their own opinions. And then, he just let Gary Lineker do what he wanted. So he said all these things, but then he didn't have the courage to actually intervene and sack people when sackings were needed. Jennie said they knew about Panorama in May. Well, Samir Shah, the chairman, said in his letter to MPs today they knew about it in January. And rather than doing something about it, rather than saying, oh dear, we've made this terrible mistake, we need to apologise, we need to correct it, they did nothing. They left it on BBC iPlayer for another 11 months. They hoped it would all go away. It didn't. That is weak leadership. And they need strong leadership. They need somebody who can crack heads together and say, we're not going to stand for this any longer.
Any names in the frame yet, Gordon?
I would not want to speculate on that. But maybe Jennie might have some better ideas.
Well, I was just going to suggest maybe Jennie, do you fancy the job yourself? It sounds like you could bring back some rigorous standards to the BBC as an almost lifer there.
I heard Alistair Campbell talking about it earlier today, saying that, maybe he might throw his hat at the ring. I'm sure he was joking about that. No, I've never involved myself with a hierarchy, even when I was working there. I didn't even know who the BBC board were. I got on with my job. So what I'm talking about are the people on the shop floor.
Do you think possibly, though, the job is just too big for one person? I mean, you're expecting one guy to be in charge of all of the output across the BBC networks around the world, the great, ginormous website, all of the drama, all of the comedy, all of the sport, all of the commercial side of the BBC that they have. It does feel to me that perhaps, the reason that the Director General can't get anything done or ends up having to carry the can for things, it's just that the job is too big.
Well, that may be the case, but honestly, I'm not sure about more chiefs. My view was just there weren't enough of us on the shop floor, and there were too many bosses having too many meetings about everything when we just needed to go and get the story.
Oh, I know that feeling. Gordon, I mean, what do you say to the sort of siren calls that are beginning to emerge again? I'm not necessarily saying from your paper as such, but when the BBC is on the ropes, the question of its future and the future funding model always comes back to fore. There's a renegotiation of its royal charter in the offing. Do you think this will see fresh calls for the BBC to lose its public support?
Well, I think Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, has already indicated that she may be looking at some kind of mixed model of funding where it may be part subscription and part license fee, part subscription. I think probably that's what's going to happen in the end, because we can all see that the world is changing, that people are going to streaming services to watch drama and sports. And I think that the BBC, when it decides who it's going to have leading it from now on, I think it probably needs to be somebody who either has a news background or understands news, because news is probably the thing that gets the BBC into the most trouble when it gets it wrong. Drama can kind of take care of itself, I would have thought. Those streamers that they're in competition with, they don't do news, so they don't need to worry about this stuff. And the reason that the license fee has remained in place for so long is partly because of the fact that the BBC provides those services like news that, other people don't. So unless they have somebody who actually knows how news works and who knows when things have gone wrong and how to fix them and how to prevent them going wrong in the first place, I think they're just going to find themselves back here again.
Jenny, in the age of Apple TV, Netflix, other streaming services are available, is it really viable to have basically British taxpayers essentially told if you don't, you would be criminalised unless you pay for this drama and this comedy? The funding model isn't fit for the modern age, really, is it?
I've always defended the licence fee, and I do think it's incredible value for money. £15 a month, about that, for all that you get, all the radio stations, all the television stations. I think it's incredible value for money, but I'm finding it hard to defend now because, my children's generation, they don't watch the BBC, they don't listen to the BBC, and yet they have to pay for it. So I do find it hard to defend that method. But I do think it's good value for money as it stands.
But on Gordon's point there, people are paying for the news service. They should be able to pick and choose which aspects of the BBC they want to have, right? That's how the world works now.
Yeah, a subscription service, you get what you pay for and you choose what you want. That's probably the road we're going to go down. Personally, I think actually there's so many trails on the BBC for every goddamn programme that's coming up. They're so annoying, they may as well put adverts in there.
You took the words right out of my mouth. It's endless cycles of adverts for the BBC, on the BBC, by the BBC, for the BBC. It goes right. Are you worried, though, that actually once the BBC is opened up to the forces of the market, essentially, people just won't pay for it and it won't be able to sustain itself? And that's why its defenders are so voraciously out there all the time, because they know that actually swimming in the great wide ocean of the market, it would sink.
Yep, standards will go down, I'm afraid, on every aspect, which is why I do still wish to defend it, but I think it's getting harder to do so.
Jenny, thank you. Final thought, Gordon. I mean, on that, it does seem that the BBC seems to be so viciously defended by its sort of its current staff and certainly its outriders because of that reason, that actually without the state support, without the threat of criminalising Britons for not subscribing to it, it would go under.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit like a communist country, isn't it, where they have to build a wall to stop people leaving. If the BBC is brilliant, people will want to pay for it.
Yes. East Germany was so brilliant, people just wanted to stay there. I might steal that analogy for a column later this week. Gordon Rayner in sunny LA, though you wouldn't be able to tell from his backdrop there, and Jennie Bond in London with a wonderful bookshelf collection there. Thank you for joining us tonight. Still in the studio with me, Sarah Selip, Republican consultant or strategist, and Connor Stringer. Gordon's gone. Connor Stringer from the Telegraph. Sarah, on that point, as an American, when you kind of look at this idea, does it slightly baffle you? It's like, if you don't pay your TV licence, you can technically be criminalised. I think you can, Connor will correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can face jail time if you repeatedly refuse to pay it. And you're having, these views rammed down your throat that you don't necessarily agree with or want, but you have to do it if you want to have a TV in Britain. As an American, how does that strike you?
Very surprising, but I mean, look at what happened this year with the PBS fight, with PBS funding. That's the only thing that I can really mirror this back to, because it has been used against us again and again and again in the American media and NPR. Our own money is going towards things where there's active leftist issues. Like, there's actual propaganda being shoved down a lot of Americans' throats who might not even follow politics, and we're paying so much money for it. We don't have the licensing fees, but it seems like it mirrors it very closely.
Connor, I mean, even Jennie Bond there, one of the most famous faces of the BBC of the last, 50 years or so, 40 years, I'll give her some credit, sorry, 40 years or so, even she was unable there to properly defend the business model of the licence fee, and actually, a hybrid streaming service is looking like where it's heading, right?
I think it's the beginning of the end if that does happen. I mean, the BBC for years, like you said, has relied on everybody coughing up and being forced to pay.
But there's 300,000 people
which
now
is
who are refusing. Teletax, whatever they're...
exactly.
Conscientious objectors.
And I mean, and can you imagine a newspaper or a broadcaster with 300,000 paid subscribers that, they chop your arm off for that? That's a massive figure, and that's the kind of numbers that a lot of people are trying to chase. The BBC, unfortunately, now are in a position where they're actually behind the fold. A lot of organisations, the Telegraph included, the Mail, I think the Sun are still free to read, but are moving towards a pay subscription model. And they've felt the hurt. All of us have been forced to merge newsrooms and make cuts in order to make it work, as we've seen, subscriber levels up and down. This will be a really big headache for the BBC.
How do you think it plays out, Conor, in terms of, obviously, politicians are jumping on this already. Boris Johnson has come out, Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch. These are not traditional supporters of the BBC. Do you think it risks becoming a political bum fight that just ends up, back leaving us exactly where we are? Yeah,
of course. I mean, it's a bit of a political football at times, isn't it? It's a bit of a merry-go-round. You kick it, it's an easy hit, an easy free win. You've got the usual loyalists that say, the BBC's not fit for purpose anymore, we need reform. You've got the usual activists who say, it's the best thing since sliced bread, we need to keep it alive and well and fight for impartiality. And this is the time, I think, this is the turning point for real change now, where we've seen the implications of what happens when we have a biased state broadcaster.
So on a diplomatic level, this is suboptimal, right? I mean, this isn't any random media company. This is the British Broadcasting Corporation. It is the state broadcaster. It's probably the most famous broadcaster in the world. Certainly one of the very, very first. President Trump, in his Truth Social last night, made a point of, this is, you guys are meant to be allies. Like, this is what you expect from hostile private media, but from a state-backed thing. What impact do you think this could have on the relations politically between Britain and the United States?
I really don't think that it's going to come down to a diplomacy issue, because this is a smoking gun. We saw that leadership was held accountable. That is the big word here, accountability. We wouldn't know unless there was a whistleblower that this was doctored, but this aired a week before Election Day. And
what's the BBC doing meddling a week before Election Day?
Exactly.
Where was the Kamala Harris documentary?
But, I mean, it's called
107
Days, Harry. But that's what it comes down to. It's not going to be a diplomacy issue, but this is something we see again and again and again from media in the U.S. We're not surprised, but it's very telling that he has a Friday deadline when all of this breaks. It's Friday at 5.
Conor, do you reckon they're going to have to get the check back out? Because it's British licence fee paying money. This isn't just some executive that have to.
Absolutely, and I think you mentioned earlier about it, being a bit of a turning the screw issue. But $1 billion, put that into perspective, the BBC's annual revenue last year was $5.7 billion. That's a fifth if it ever came to it. And talk about turning the screws and the hurt. They're going to be in a difficult place.
President Trump hasn't actually issued legal proceedings yet. He's sent a threatening letter. Obviously, they don't have the First Amendment protection. That you'd have in the United States. Realistically, how strong is this case, do you think?
Well, actually, in the Florida courts, it's quite high. The threshold is relatively easy to hit, and the issue is that case speaks for itself. You've seen the footage; it's pretty damning. But this is kind of textbook Trump. You set a really massive high figure that kind of puts the legal threat and fear into your opposition, and then settle after. I think in the CBS case, it was $16 million. So I expect this to follow a similar strategy if they follow through.
Do you reckon, Sarah, they're going to have to cough up?
I honestly think so, or at least a really big apology. We're at that
a grovel. The BBC's being caught red-handed. Top bosses out, trust shattered, viewers furious. But the big question is, what comes next? Because this isn't the first time any media empire has imploded under the weight of its own bias. CBS spent years drowning in its own woke fog. Newsrooms obsessed with pronouns and politics, not facts. And the result? Well, viewers fled. Credibility cratered. Enter Barry Weiss, brought in to drag CBS back from reality and rebuild trust, and to remind them what journalism is used to mean. The Telegraph's Conor Stringer and Republican strategist Sarah Selip are still with me in the studio, and joining me from, I think, sunny Texas tonight is Isabella Deluca, commentator. Isabella, across the West and across newsrooms in America, it does feel to me like we've reached something of a tipping point post-Trump 2.0 in the fact that all the wokies seem to be having a bit of a reckoning, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Democrats for the first time realized how out of touch that they'd become with their audience, especially the legacy media, which is one, why public distrust in the media is sitting at like probably over 70% now. And there's a reason why X is the #1 news platform in the world, and it is because the legacy media can't be trusted. They're so left-wing that they've become so out of touch even with their own voter base, which is why I think that they lost the 2024 election, because they'd been focusing on catering to a niche of people that were far left, the transgender issue, the abortion issue, when in reality people couldn't afford groceries, they couldn't afford gas, they were working multiple jobs, and above all, they were covering up the biggest political and mental decline of a sitting U.S. president, and they really did it so that Kamala Harris could win, that they could push her over the top. And I think them trying to do a rebrand is them trying to save themselves, but to be honest, I don't know that it will work for them.
So you think the Rubicon's being crossed? We're past the point of no return, and bringing one conservative, or even, but not even that conservative, right-of-centre voice into leading a network like CBS won't be enough, and actually we're past the point of no return.
I mean, honestly, again, I mean, I go back to the 60-minute interview that they edited of Kamala Harris to try and prop her up as a candidate that knew what she was talking about, was well-versed on the issues. And it's like, how can you even trust legacy media at all after what they did and how they reported on Joe Biden during his 4 years of presidency? If it was Donald Trump, I mean, they'd be coming after him at every single angle. Again, they covered up a mental and cognitive decline of Joe Biden to prop him up as a candidate because they were so anti-Trump. And again, I don't think that the legacy media could be trusted at all. I don't see how anybody goes to watching CBS after getting their news from X. I mean, to be honest, everyone that I know gets their news from X. I get my news from X. I don't watch any legacy media, to be completely honest with you. I
mean, and not as cratering numbers for Generation Z, as we call it, or Generation Z, as the Americans might say. Is that an ideal world, though? I mean, frankly, there is a case on both sides of we're all journalists now, anyone can pump out anything on X. But don't the American public and the wider Western public need some guardrails of some sort in media organizations to know what's good for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that goes for anything. But there's the saying that if it bleeds, it leads. And I think that for far too long, chaos and division has generated clicks and ad revenue for a lot of these news organizations. And they've essentially profited off of a lot of the division that they spewed, even at the cost of lying to the American public, as you saw in the edited BBC interview that they did of Donald Trump. And they do that to generate outrage and division. And I think just the American people and just people in general are tired of it.
Well, I think one man that's tired of it is Donald Trump. He's mad as hell. He's not going to take it anymore. This is, the BBC, he's threatened to sue for $1 billion unless they apologise and grovel by Friday. He's had his own run-in with CBS, he's had his run-in with CNN, he's had his run-in with other media organisations as well. Is this a unique moment we're in because of President Trump, in the fact that, it's almost like the media need President Trump more than President Trump needs the media, and he's able to throw his weight around? If President Trump, whatever happens next, whoever comes next, will they really have the same ability to break up the networks as he seems to be doing?
I don't think so, to be honest. I think Donald Trump is a special kind of man, and I think that, again, they by using his name and by generating some sort of chaos and division, they do that by mentioning his name. The interview that you're mentioning that they edited was regarding January 6th. And I think that's important to talk about, because January 6th, under the 4 years of Joe Biden, it probably could have been a national holiday, the amount of times that the media and Democrats talked about it. But again, they profited off of a lot of outrage that came with January 6th, and that's why they edited the interview. I mean, I was arrested for January 6th, so I can probably speak on this a little bit more, but they intentionally did that because I think January 6th was the last stronghold that the legacy media had on the people that actually watched the legacy media still at that point, to drive outrage that, these domestic terrorists were taking over the country. And they took that all the way with them to the 2024 election. And that's why I say that they lost, because they talked about abortion, they talked about transgenderism, they still talked about January 6th. And let's be honest, by 2024, no one gave a shit about January 6th anymore. It wasn't the top leading issue in the United States. And so I think Trump is kind of doing a power move here by having BBC apologize. If I were him, I'd have them apologize apologize, and I'd still probably sue. So,
I mean, to be fair, he did get, he was charged by Congress of inciting an insurrection. I mean,
yeah.
They kind of had a point, right?
Yeah, I mean, rightfully so. I mean, everyone there was a domestic terrorist, and they all came with their weapons. And I always like to say that the January 6th committee that was investigating the January 6th crimes were pardoned before the people that were actually participating in January 6th. So, there goes that narrative of what they thought that was.
And if you were a betting woman, do you predict the BBC are going to have to cough up like CBS did before them?
I think so.
What $1 billion seems a bit much. What do you reckon would be a fair figure?
I think apology is probably the best way to go. Again, if I was Donald Trump, I would take that apology and I'd still sue. So we'll see what he does with that.
Well, the BBC will be hoping he's more benevolent than you. Isabella Deluca, thank you for joining us from sunny Texas there. CBS, really interesting sort of moment in American media, Sarah. They've sort of brought in Bari Weiss, who was this, to the woke comment pages of the New York Times, she was seen as a swivel-eyed, hard-right lunatic. Actually, her views are pretty mainstream, but she was sort of forced out in the height of the woke wars a few years ago from the New York Times. She then set up the Free Press, which has now turned out to be a remarkably successful company, which she just flogged to CBS for, I think, $120 million. Bringing in one right-of-centre voice isn't going to be enough to save CBS from its cratering viewing figures and, frankly, public disinterest.
I think we have to circle back to something Isabella said that was really poignant. So there is a difference between the fake news media and the legacy media. Unfortunately, there are a lot of organizations, we'll just go back to Reagan for a second, even Newt Gingrich, that have evolved to a point where commentators sometimes think that they are journalists, and obviously with social media, right? But when you see Capitol Hill staffers adding sources to tweets, like, you're not that serious. But in that vein, how many of these even lefties, like Tara Palomari, Chris Cillizza, are going to Substack instead and still securing exclusives?
What do you do? How do you differentiate between the legacy media and the fake news media, as you put it?
I think fake news media would be more like the MSDNC, obviously CBS pre-Bari Weiss, but it just depends on the evolution. And there are a lot, like I think Fox News did a really good job of this, where with Megyn Kelly after the outing, right after the first presidential election in the first term, there really was a moment where they came back and they said, okay, this is our identity, this is our value here, let's bring in the right talent to secure this. And they've really went above and beyond, especially in the 7 p.m. hour, where they've secured the 18 to 34-year-old vote more than any other news outlet, which ads are going towards it, ad buyers are going towards that, and you don't normally see those hours.
Connor, I mean, it feels like they're sort of slamming the stable door after the horse is bolted. There we go. That's the one. I mean, it's too late, right? Kids ain't watching BBC or CBS or
yeah, I think there's an
CNN.
element, possibly, but I actually think there's potential. I mean, we're seeing it a little bit with Bari Weiss, whereby actually if you kind of restructure, you throw your weight behind getting rid of some of the issues and problems you think that have been infested in an organisation. She's got rid of a couple of presenters, looking to potentially hire some Fox News talent and reposition the organisation from the ground up. I think with the help of Donald Trump and some friendly interviews, you saw 60 Minutes, it's possible.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, she's being leaked and briefed against left, right and centre. I mean, there's almost an entire cottage industry around stories around Bari Weiss coming from the very staff she's meant to be trying to lead.
Which is ridiculous in the first place, but she'll be going into that job knowing the challenge she faces. I mean, like you say, she was sacked and faced the full weight of the woke mob when she was running the opinion pages of the New York Times. She knows what she's walking. Yeah, exactly. And that's the same kind of rhetoric that she'll be bringing in, and that's why she's been brought in to do it.
Do you think the BBC could do something similar? I've written a long job application to be the Director General of the BBC in tomorrow's Sun newspaper.
Yes, but essentially, I think the issue with this is we, for too long, have maybe focused on the kind of upper structure of the BBC and kind of pointing fingers and not actually drilled down into appointing somebody with a right news brain who's willing to stand up to those and push back against the criticism you mentioned internally and build it from the ground up, really bring in the right people that need to make a change here.
It is astonishing watching the BBC stuff play out, and the fact that there is one executive at the BBC they're clearly out to, the left are clearly out to get. So Robbie Gibb, former Newsnight, BBC editor. He then went to work in government for Theresa May briefly in that fun period that it must have been for everyone involved. But now he's on the BBC. He's on the BBC board. yes, he is obviously identifiably a Conservative, because he has served a Conservative government. Nothing to me says we are a liberal, biased organisation by trying to drum the one Tory guy out.
Absolutely.
It's madness, right?
It's like a pack of wolves going after the one sheep they come across, and that's it. It's almost like strength in numbers. I think we've got to a point where the BBC is so inundated with people, perhaps those with left-wing leanings, that it's become almost groupthink. And we've got to a point where it's just a ganging up.
But you and I both have friends and colleagues and rivals in the BBC News department. There are, a brilliant journalist, but it does seem to me that as you say, that groupthink seems to have permeated out of the cultural BBC into the news. How'd they get out of this, and can they?
I think it's possible. Like I said, I think it's going to have to take some editorial direction. Someone to come in with the kind of great determination to grasp that challenge, not be afraid to stand up to the left and those people who who are throwing the mud, and say, look, this is how we're going to do things. If you don't like it, leave, and face, and have someone above them that can support them to do that. Some top cover and some real grit and determination.
So Donald Trump is, he did it in 2016 or in 2015 and 2016 by sort of, by using Twitter to sort of hijack and bypass the mainstream media. He's doing it, he set up his own social network with True Social. Every single journalist in Washington has notifications on their phone for ping, here's what the president's doing. He has completely changed the media landscape. He's not going to be here forever, though, unless he runs again, which is looking increasingly unlikely and unconstitutional. Is the media fundamentally changed forever, or will, under a future Democratic administration or a J.D. Vance or Rubio administration, see a more return to these traditional gatekeepers of the legacy media?
Honestly, as someone who knows the communicators in charge of most of these agencies, this is honestly, when Caroline Leavitt says it's the most transparent administration in history, it is completely on the nose. And that's not just saying because Joe Biden and his camp lied to us for 4 years. This is because there is no issue with telling the people what they need to know and what the president's thinking. We don't have a president, decaying behind the doors. We have one that's actually talking maybe a little bit too much sometimes.
No, it's great for us. No, in terms of access.
We always know where he stands. It's not an auto pen. We know exactly what's going on. As much as we love it or hate it, and it's at 3 a.m, we know what's going on with the president and his cabinet.
But has he fundamentally broken the model, or it's just? I'm trying to understand. Is it Trump, or is it now this is how it's going to be forever? And as Isabella was saying, that she gets all of her news off X, she gets all of her news off TikTok, and so does half a generation. Well, in fact, 99% of generations. Have we reached a tipping point?
I've written about this at length. It goes back to Stephen Chung, Stephen Miller, and Caroline Leavitt.
The powerful trio of communication advisors in the White House.
Some of the best communicators I've seen in a very long time. They've really changed the game, but it honestly does come down to the communication style. This isn't your dad's communication shop, right? These aren't the Reagan people. They're not door knocking. They're coming straight to the point. Look at the ads, the videos, the press conferences, the new media that's being brought.
Yeah.
It's really phenomenal that we have a new media seat. And that's honestly what it comes down to. What are the people listening to? What are the people watching? And where are they getting the news from? Because even with the rise of AI and commentary, you don't know if everything's correct all the time.
No, totally, yeah.
But you have the freedom to go and look and research to see what you care about, what you know, and what's actually factual.
Well, it's
nodding away there.
That's the point, isn't it? It's the messaging. They're coming in and ripping up the playbook because they want to go direct to the electorate. That's all. This is no longer we're going to go rely on the traditional media, which is you run into the stumbling blocks and doctored interviews and doctor speeches, etc. They're going straight and being creative with their messaging, which is paying off. The issue is whether whoever picks up the mantle is happy to do the same in that manner, and also is as creative. We've not seen anybody as creative. You mentioned some of the attack ads, the clever use of Pokemon.
It makes it painful to look back at London when you've got you've got a government in chaos. The latest bin fire in Downing Street is raging, and there's a sort of ChatGPT generated tweets from Keir Starmer.
I think Number 10's TikTok account hasn't been updated since 2021 or something like that. It's something utterly ridiculous.
And yet they're trying to sort of get in on this. Obviously, the Rogan strategy, we could call it, for the election, where Trump was directly speaking to podcasters and the like, rather than make sure. Number 10 have been trying it in London, but it seems like they're way behind, right?
But also they're just so so robotic, Harry, as we always kind of say. You look at these politicians that are wheeled out, and they're so paranoid about and worried about towing the right government line. That's why Farage has done so well.
Yeah, well, he's kind of done the Trump model. Not just the fireworks, but the slick social media game.
Exactly. Robert Jenrick too. And he's risen the ranks, and also his own popularity and his own stature because he's got a really slick social media campaign. This election with Trump was the kind of case study for new media, right? Mm-hmm. And the benefits and the power of what it has. We saw with Obama, it was social media. This was new media.
The BBC's still ongoing legal headache. Donald Trump's threatened to sue the BBC, as we discussed at some length yesterday, for $1 billion after he was caught faking the president's words in that now infamous documentary about January 6th. Looks like a grovelling apology may be the starting point, but could the world's most famous broadcaster really end up in a Florida courtroom? Joining me tonight is Republican lawyer and strategist Mehek Cooke. Good evening, Ms. Cooke. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Is this another one of Donald Trump's sort of threats where he says, $1 billion, and then actually the whole case slightly falls apart? Are we really going to see the BBC in a Florida courtroom? Or, I don't think he'd have much truck in London trying to get $1 billion off the state broadcaster.
Well, I think President Trump is very serious because this was election interference days before the election where you're manipulating voters, and everybody wants to say, BBC, you're only watching it in the UK. No, we're actually watching it here in America because of social media and the way that clips go viral. So you have two separate clips of President Trump speaking that the BBC decided to put together to make it seem like the president was inciting violence. Any American watching that would think, gosh, I shouldn't vote for President Trump. Many of us did further research and debunked that. So yes, President Trump is serious. I also think at the end of the day, this is not just about this legal case, but about accountability. And he's already gotten it with an apology and two executives stepping down.
So he's gone after CBS, he's gone after the New York Times, he's gone after the Wall Street Journal, he's gone after all sorts of media organisations. No one seems to be spared. The New York Times basically told him to jog on, essentially, and they wouldn't be backing down. What do you expect the BBC to do, given this is a sort of plucky Britain versus the Trump White House? How do you think it would go down if Friday 5 o'clock comes and the BBC say, thank you, but no thank you, no dice?
I don't think the BBC is going to do that because you've already seen two major executives actually fold and crumble under the pressure. And when you have an independent analysis and somebody's saying, hey, do not put this documentary out, you're spreading lies, and you still do the worst thing for the BBC right now, it's not even this legal case, it is discovery. And that will be shocking and damning because so many execs, mark my words, were involved in this cover-up. So I think what the BBC should do, my legal advice to them, is to crumble and figure out a settlement where they make President Trump whole. And we continue to show that media will always win through the truth. That's what we need today. That's what the president is demanding of every single news outlet. Love him or hate it, we want the truth.
For our viewers and listeners in the UK, we're a mixed audience here. Can you just run us through how that process would work in a Florida courtroom? London is a little bit trickier, and I don't think the libel bar is quite high, and it's also it also involves much smaller sums of money. But if the president was to pursue, as he is threatening, the BBC through Florida, how would it work, and what are the possible outcomes?
So I think a legal case in Florida, generally when you're talking about a public figure like President Trump or any other public figure, you have to prove actual malice, proof that the BBC knew or recklessly discarded the truth and created a false impression. So you actually have to show harm. And then it's about reputational and economic harm. Here, the fact that you had an independent analysis and a report saying this is not accurate, this will cause harm. And now the BBC has actually said, yes, we're sorry, we made a mistake. That's enough, in my opinion, to show malice. Now, what the BBC is going to argue is First Amendment. We're a news organization, and in Florida, this is one of the strongest states for the news media and First Amendment. So it may be harder to prove and for President Trump to win. But I think this win comes down to a settlement, like I said, because discovery will be damning for the BBC and accountability, which we're already getting as they are seeing executives resign, and I think there'll be many more.
$1 billion is a sixth of the turnover of the entire organisation. Obviously, he threatened CBS with a similar sized bill, but they ended up settling for, I think, around $26 million. Where do you suspect this would actually end up if they do settle?
I think it'll be in the millions, but at the end of the day, if you think about the election, and if BBC had tipped the scale and many Americans didn't do their research, we'd be looking at Kamala Harris and not President Trump. So the truth matters, journalism matters, and the fact that President Trump has asked for $1 billion is because he has staked everything in his election and then getting reelected. And for BBC or any other news outlet to spread vile lies that continue to daunt him through even this election when we talked about January 6th, it's just despicable.
Ms. Cooke, stay there. I'm going to bring in Jon Levine from the Washington Free Beacon. Jon, I mean, suing the BBC, on that point there, suing the BBC makes for good headlines, but this is actually a president who actually hasn't had a huge amount of time before he potentially is in hock to Congress, before he becomes a sort of lame duck, before the cycle moves on to who's next. It's all very well throwing these lawsuits around, but, actually, is this not just a distraction from the day-to-day running of the country?
Well, the president sues a lot of news organizations, as you mentioned, and some of them are much less legitimate than others. And maybe this one has more merit than his suit against the Wall Street Journal for the Epstein letter, which they later did produce. But to your point, I wish he would be running the country more. I think it kind of is undignified, the office of the president, to be launching lawsuits against media organizations. If he wins any money from the BBC, correct me if I'm wrong, that's your taxpayer money that will be coming into the United States. So I feel bad that we're milking you a little bit for that. And I think the BBC, multiple executives have now resigned. I think they clearly realize the error that they made. And as a member of the media, I don't love the idea of launching lawsuits against the press in general. I think self-regulation and press freedom is a better way to go.
Just we talked about it at length all week, obviously, but on that BBC fandango with the editing, it's obviously cost the Director General, the CEO of BBC News their jobs. Friday, 5 o'clock, the deadline for a grovelling apology. I suspect we're going to see that, aren't we? I mean, what options really does the BBC have, given they've already admitted kind of bad faith in the fact that they said they got it badly wrong? They're going to have to grovel, right?
I think the fact you have the chairman saying that the specific example, obviously it was a wider dossier of BBC problems, but what Donald Trump is paying attention to is that Panorama mixed editing of a speech. And the fact that the BBC themselves has said that it gave a misleading impression, suggested it made it seem as though the president was inciting direct violence when he wasn't, does make you think is not too much further a step to do, an effusive apology, particularly with the risk of a lawsuit, which we've seen Donald Trump, particularly in the second term, use these lawsuits against American broadcasters, media companies, to have his voice heard. And often they're settled, but he will keep going. And it's not clear to me the BBC really wants to keep going with that fight.
Elizabeth Pipko, I mean, will a grovelling apology be enough, or do you reckon they're going to have to get their chequebook out? Well, the British public's chequebook out. They licence fee payers are the ones that are going to be stung here. Do you think the White House and Donald Trump understands that this isn't just your average media company? Actually, he'll be stinging hard-working Brits.
I'm sure he does understand. Look, it depends just how much of an apology is given, right? It depends on the depth of the groveling. So we will have to see. I'm waiting on the edge of my seat for Friday. I'm curious to see what happens. I have been on the BBC quite a few times. They haven't treated me very fairly myself, so I would say that I'm a little biased on the subject, but I am curious to see what happens, and I do think he's definitely owed an apology at minimum, but mostly so are the viewers, because I think it's a little much at this point. We've been watching the Donald Trump show for 10 years. At this point, people have an opinion. There's no need to edit and try to sway anybody in one way or the other.
I mean, in terms of the BBC, obviously it has a unique position in Britain because of its charter and because of the fact it is publicly funded. How, straying into the politics, does it reflect badly on Britain as a whole when you've got the White House literally going for what is essentially a sort of long arm of the state?
Well, unfortunately, I think the entire world is kind of as polarized as we are over here. So it depends who you ask. I would say that it does, but again, people are going to choose a side based on how they feel about Donald Trump and based on how they personally feel about the BBC. I think if you watch this network every day and you like the things that they say and the way they talk about him, you would think that he was 100% wrong. And if you hate everything they say and you hate watch it every day and you support Donald Trump, you're going to say they better grovel their butts off or expect to pay up. But I mean, again, the entire world has made up their mind about Donald Trump. So this entire editing fiasco is absolutely ridiculous.
Katie, final question. I mean, is there really much kickback for the BBC domestically in terms of the government can't be, they came out and said what a shining city on the hill and great light it is, but behind the scenes, it is a bit of a diplomatic headache to have, the president taking to Truth Social to basically say, hey, we're meant to be allies.
Yeah, it is, and it's another example of how, despite having a good personal relationship, there's clearly things that are going to strain UK-US. I think here the UK government's trying to be quite careful in terms of how much they really say on it.
Yeah.
They don't want to look as though they're taking the BBC's side, but they also don't want to be on the ire of, BBC supporters and look like they're being sycophantic.
Friends, viewers, countrymen, lend me your ears. Consider this my formal application for the role of Director General of the BBC. Now, hear me out, because I know I am not a Guardian reader. And the BBC is run by Guardian readers. Quite literally, far more copies go in the door than any other paper. Far more views from work computers at the BBC than any other paper. And far more BBC stories are based on Guardian pieces than any other paper. I know some staff really do try with impartiality, certainly harder than other broadcasters. But it's in the DNA of Guardian readers to give themselves and their fellow progressives the benefit of the doubt, which is, I think, where the corporation has been going wrong of late. However, like my 17 would-be predecessors, I am a white bloke who has never run a £6 billion business before, so I feel my qualifications are more than sufficient. But I suspect I could shave a few billion off those costs with a little light housekeeping. Let's start with the most pernicious secret the BBC spaffs cash on. £169 million spent on TV licence enforcement. And no more prosecutions under single justice procedures to criminalise dotty old dears who forget to pay their telly tax. Next, an immediate end to gold-plated pensions. That will save £541 million a year. £500 million. You have to wonder how many former BBC lovies will suddenly stop tweeting how much they love Auntie when they're weaned off of that teat. What about another issue, one dear to the hearts of managing editors across the media? Ban all taxi travel. The BBC spent an eye-watering £18 million in just 3 years on trains, taxis and hotels. One cab cost £288. Another from Salford near Manchester to Oxford was a whopping £484. That 18 million is the equivalent of 100,000 licence fee payers' money. There, spent on jollies. Get rid of it. Cut. And then we move on to the easy stuff. The disgraced Hamas propaganda shop, BBC Arabic Services, would be disbanded on my watch on day one. They've been pushing straight-up propaganda against Israel for years, parroting Hamas talking points, minimising terrorism and victim-blaming. So the world's most trusted broadcaster running cover for extremists. Well, no more. Sorry, Jeremy Bowen. If you like it so much, you're going to have to stay there for free. Next, goodbye, trans issues editors, LGBTQ+ specialist correspondents. An entire corporation has been hijacked by the militant trans activist lobby. Newsreader Martine Croxer was punished for simply rolling her eyes after being fed the phrase pregnant people down the autocue rather than the simple word women. Not saying anything, just rolling her eyes. That will no longer be a thought crime at my BBC. I will also end senior management's woke indulgence of the growth of staff networks that act as internal lobbying groups, making incessant demands to influence the output. No longer will bosses have to be scared to cross them over fears of accusations of bigotry and discrimination. Not on my watch. Instead, every member of staff will be required to sign a legally enforceable pledge of impartiality. It will define these balances and make sure that bias is a dismissible offence. Who else can we get rid of? Climate editors. The £267,000 a year diversity champions scheme boss. Goodbye, thank you. 15 other diversity officers in the building there. They can share a leaving drinks with the outgoing Director General, Tim Davie. What next? BBC Verify. Ah, yes. I mean, surely that bizarre outfit, it claims to fact-check matters, has proven itself willfully blind these last few months at the BBC. The only conspiracy theory that needs debunking these days is the idea BBC bosses are pushing that their poor beloved BBC is victim of some vast right-wing shadowy network out to destroy it. Fact check. The only people to blame for the current mess are the ones that lied and covered up the very report the BBC paid to verify its own failings. Sinister political plots to destroy the corporation. Guys, you don't need any help with that. BBC Verify verdict? Gone. On a theme, there will also be an end to £100,000 a month fees for management consultants. Why not launch a simple quiz show called Cut or Don't Cut? We could easily do this in-house at the BBC. I mean, what are all these managers doing themselves all day already? The show could be live streamed with an important audience participation. Amal Rajan, he's not doing much, or Fiona Bruce, yeah, they're short of a few viewing hours, so they could host a daily show that rips through the BBC budget, and licence fee payers can watch and text in where they believe each line by line is value for their hard-earned cash. Cut or don't cut. I like it. Space now prohibits me from sharing my plans for BBC Drama, BBC Comedy, and don't forget Glastonbury, but I suspect you know where I'm coming from on those matters. Thank you for your attention to this matter, and I look forward to discussing my plans further with you, the BBC board, at your earliest convenience. Wishing you all the very best, guys.